Welcome to SchneiderB FM. This is the podcast to help you use the internet to market your school in order to achieve your enrollment goals. I'm your host, Brendan Schneider.
Welcome to episode 17, where my guest today is Brian Kaplan. Brian's a New York City-based marketing and communications consultant who operates a practice called BrainKap Communications. He's a former MarCom director at independent schools, and prior to that, he ran a marketing and public relations firm called Impression PR. In today's episode, we're going to talk about crisis communication planning and all that that entails. Brian's going to share elements of plan, when you should create your plan, things that you should do, some things that you shouldn't do. And in the end, he's going to wrap up with what to do after the plan. I learned a number of things from our conversation. I'm sure you will as well. So I hope you enjoy our conversation. But before we get started, let's hear from our sponsor.
This episode of SchneiderB FM is sponsored by the VirCon 6, which is my school marketing virtual conference. The VirCon 6 will take place live on October 13th. It includes 9 school marketing experts teaching and sharing actionable tips that will help you become a better school marketer. Your registration includes access to the live presentations as well as all of the recordings. I've tried sincerely to make this conference an incredible value because you can also share the recordings with your entire team. To see who the presenters are and their topics, please check out www.vircon6.com. That's VIRCON, the number 6.com.
Brian, welcome to SchneiderB FM.
Thank you, Brendan. Good to be here.
Great. So to get started, can you share a little bit about your background and your story?
Sure. So I'm a New York City-based marketing and communications consultant. I was formerly a marketing and communications director at a number of independent schools, predominantly in New York City. But then I also went out to Scottsdale, Arizona for a little while to help a school out there. That was quite rewarding, but I'm a New Yorker, so I came back. And 2 years ago, I started my consultancy called BrainKap Communications, a bit of a play on my name there. So BrainKap. Cap with a K. If you want to look it up, it's brainkap.com. And I'm working with a number of New York City schools on crisis communications and branding and video and photography, all sorts of different areas, everything that a director of communications is involved in.
Great. And for us, this podcast, this episode really started out of something fun from this summer, which was you were in Pittsburgh. And you reached out, and we got to have breakfast together, which was a blast. I hope you thought the same thing.
I certainly did.
Which was fun. Not many people come to Pittsburgh. Do you want to say why you were in Pittsburgh?
Sure. So my son and wife were doing a story for Parade magazine where we traveled to about 12 different cities, ranging from Philadelphia, Baltimore, D.C., Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Chicago, and Detroit. And they were both writing about baseball stadiums and the cities that the baseball stadiums were in. So my son interviewed a number of players. We went to different games over I think it was about 25-day period. Okay. And my wife wrote about the city. So if we were in Chicago, for example, or actually let's say Pittsburgh, and we got to go into the dugout, and we met a couple of the players there, and we spoke to, I think actually also the executive chef, spoiled us with some great food. But it was a great experience, and then my wife wrote about the Pittsburgh food experience and the city itself as well. So a really great time.
No, that was great, and I did check out some of your son's writing his experiences, which was really cool. And it's just fun. I mean, we had talked on the phone a number of times, but it was just fun to hang out in real life.
Exactly.
So I'm glad you made the effort to reach out. So, and then that conversation, so pancakes and coffee, led us to this, and the topic today, we're going to talk about crisis communications. And to jump right in, can you kind of share your vision or your idea, like the goal or objectives of crisis management planning, crisis communications?
Sure. So the goal and objective for a crisis plan is to be as prepared as possible. No one can prevent a problem or a crisis from happening, but with preparation and teamwork, the objective is to handle the problem before it becomes a crisis. And I can go into a little bit of what the difference between a problem and a crisis is. The difference is that when something gets a little too far out of control, it can be a crisis, and it can happen very, very quickly. So schools that are prepared to handle a problem or a crisis for that matter can do a much better job of extinguishing the problem before it becomes a crisis and returning the school and the community back to a safe environment for children, parents, and a school staff. The other thing I would add to that is that a crisis communications plan or a management plan should also define what the intentions are and how it will accomplish them for each audience. So, for example, how it would handle a social media crisis or how it would handle a sexual misconduct. Those things have to be really spelled out and really put into the plan and very specifically identified how they will be addressed.
So you're a proponent of doing this before the crisis happens?
Yeah, absolutely. I have, as a director of communications and various groups that I went to, I can't even tell you how many times I heard people say, well, I'll address the problem when it happens. And that's just not a possibility. You might get lucky and be able to extinguish a problem, but if it is a crisis, there needs to be a plan that's in place. And one thing that I frequently tell schools is that, for starters, having an up-to-date crisis communications plan is actually a responsibility of the school's board of trustees. Because if there is a major situation, there is a high likelihood that there will be financial implications. So the board is actually mandated to have a good, up-to-date crisis plan in place. And when I do tell directors of communications that, and they emphasize that with heads of schools, they seem to get a little bit more in the mood to address this earlier.
I was going to ask, so in your experience in working with schools, Brian, I'm afraid to find the answer out to this question. Do most schools you're working with have something in place, or are you kind of the first person that's getting it together for them?
Schools have a management program, a crisis management program in place. So it says what to do when there's a fire, what to do if there's a viral outbreak, how to handle certain aspects of it. I think most schools are very good about having those. I would say probably 80%. But crisis communications is something that really has not officially taken off yet. So that might be about half, about 40% or so of those schools. And they take it seriously, but most people that work in the administration of a school, they understand how busy things are. So the good intentions mean that things get just sort of backburnered more often than they should. And through these conversations about keeping crisis communications plan up to date, I always say don't backburner this. It's just far too important. And the biggest reason is that anybody who has been in a crisis situation can relate to the absolute fear and panic that sets in. You know, it's a natural reaction for human beings. So the more prepared and practiced a school is, the better it will respond during any kind of a problem.
I couldn't agree with you more, and that reminds me of kind of a story, or I guess it's a story, but we talk about, and this was years ago, about people were afraid, schools in particular, were afraid to get on social media because they were afraid of what people might comment or say. And really, see, I took your advice without even having talked to you yet, but I would say to people, come up with let's pick on Facebook, and I used to call them, I'm a Harry Potter fan, so the term there was a howler, a bad email or communication. Yeah. And I'm like, plan before the howler comes. So come up with the idea of what you're going to do, step 1, 2, 3, before that comment is posted. And do it when everybody's calm and rational and everything's okay. Because when that howler comes, everybody loses their mind.
Yeah.
And it's what you're saying, right? I mean, that's exactly what you're saying.
Exactly. I think it goes without saying that schools and everybody are seeing more and more problems stemming from social media. And that doesn't mean throw the baby out with the bathwater. Yeah. That means identify ways to do what social media was set out to do: listen, dialogue, have conversation, and take time to really address it like you would so many other facets of what we do in any realm of communications. But it really is an important aspect to listen, to be prepared, and to communicate these things. I mean, if you think about how things could have been resolved I'm not going to name any specific schools, but how things could have been resolved better had people been monitoring the conversations that were taking place, and they had, really been identifying what the chatter was. So I think that that's a really important aspect. And one other thing, not to hamper too much on social media, but involve students, involve parents. If more people are listening and they're monitoring social media channels of other students and people who discuss schools, there would be many fewer problems because a lot of people are reaching out. They're searching for people just to vent. And if you are almost an advocate for them, and if you can engage in dialogue, you're going to be in a much better position.
Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit. Let's say that I'm a school and I have my, crisis management plan. So like I know what to do for fire drill, I know what to do in a shelter in and things like that. And they don't have the communications plan. So short of hiring you, how can they dip their toe in the water? What are the things they need to do? What does a plan consist of? Stuff like that.
So short of hiring a crisis consultant, and clearly I'm an advocate for that, not just for me, but there are several people that do what we do. But most important is to plan ahead. And as I said, during a crisis, time is the great enemy. That's really one of the most important things to remember, because if a school does not prepare for the crisis, it will end badly. I've seen it firsthand. I have been in about 7 or so different crisis situations myself, and each time, not being prepared has not really worked that well for the school, as you could imagine. Yeah. That's one of the reasons that I began taking crisis management so seriously many, many years ago. Schools need to also develop and prepare a core crisis team and also an expanded crisis team. And I can share what the difference is between the two.
Yeah, could you go into that? Yeah.
A core team is about 10 to 15 people, ranging from the head of school, a trustee, division directors, business manager, facilities director, IT, director of communications, a few teachers that would be very good and resilient during a problem, and also preferably, as I mentioned, a crisis consultant. Those are your core team. Those are the people that are going to really put the planning together with you. They're going to train together. They are going to be the ones that others will rely on when there is a problem that could become a crisis. That's really important, because while it could be what the director of communications frequently is called a chief crisis officer, generally speaking, it's going to be a team that's going to really help everybody figure this out and do it the best way possible. And you think to yourself, okay, well, really, do we need a business manager to be involved in this? And the answer is yes. I mean, think about it. There will be financial aspects that come up during a problem or during a crisis. And having the business manager there to train and to prepare and be ready for this is a really important aspect. Same with IT, clearly, and facilities, people that know electricity, they know all the different aspects of where things are in a school. Now, jumping back to the expanded team, An expanded team can be a school psychologist. It could be the school's legal counsel. One of the most overlooked people that we really don't think about is the receptionist, people that are on the front line. I mean, he or she might be on the front line of taking those phone calls. And if the receptionist is cool, calm, and collected and well-trained, then he or she will know where to point any kind of inquiries, and also keep parents, much more calm and understanding of things, and be able to share those details. Members of the Parents Association, 1 to 2 parents, and maybe a couple students as well. And I say that because students, as I mentioned earlier, students and parents can be really the best advocates for social media. But more than that, they can also really help parents calm down. They can communicate well with the other students. They have a lot of value as far as the sincerity. They're not paid employees who are, a communications director. And so really having students and parents on your expanded crisis team can be very, very valuable. So a couple other things after you develop these core teams and you start the planning phase, I generally advise compiling a playbook of potential problems and crises. For each scenario, there should be a way to address and resolve the issue, and what are the specific responsibilities of each team member. That way, you'll know who's going to be in the cafeteria, who's going to be in the lobby, who's taking care of the second grade, who's taking care of the ninth grade, so on and so forth. And by really addressing these problems and resolving where people should be so that it's well prepped, a lot of these things will be resolved much, much more effectively. And one thing I say is that the approach to a crisis is something will go as unplanned. You didn't plan it to be that way.
Sure.
And if that's the approach that you take, then you're going to resolve things before they become a crisis. I always advocate for the school's director of communications to prepare letter templates, talking points, 2 to 3 press releases, and social media responses well in advance. And you say, well, there's no way we could plan those things well in advance. Well, you actually can. You can put them together so that you say, here is something that is much more related to a health issue, and here is something that's much more related to cybersecurity, something that's viral related. And that way, the reason being that during the crisis, as I said, time being the great enemy, most professionals would have a difficult time writing out these responses when it's not a stressful time. Yeah. Imagine trying to deal with a major problem. You have 10 people at least barking at you saying, I need you to do this, I need you to look into that. Having the guts of those things, the letter templates and talking points and press releases in place is very, very advantageous for everybody. The director of communications should contact members of the media who cover education and really establish those relationships with them so that they think that the DOC is their first person that they're going to get in touch with. These relationships are very important, and most importantly, you really don't want the media talking to parents or people that might not know about things. So establishing those relationships is really very, very important. Once the crisis plan has been put together, and there are a number of books that people can buy to get a better understanding of how to build these crisis plans. I always say that there should be a book with tabs in it so that people know how to find what they're looking for in times of a crisis, and also have digital copies, have a PDF of the crisis plan and any kind of accompanying documents on people's cell phones. Because imagine if you are in the auditorium and a crisis happens and you are evacuated from the school. Well, most people have their cell phones with them, but they might not have access to their office where they can grab that binder and take it with them. So having something on your cell phone, every member of the crisis team, of the core team, should have that PDF on their phones as well. The example that I give as well is, imagine you are rehearsing to do Annie, the play, the theater group is doing Annie, and you haven't rehearsed it. Or imagine that you have a football team and they haven't practiced. How successful is either going to be, right? So it's very, very important to rehearse these things, to practice them, to anticipate for a lot of things that could go wrong. So when I work with schools, those are all some of the immediate facets that I would recommend as early stages to putting a crisis plan together. That's
great, and there's a lot of stuff in there. And the last piece I want to drive home is that practice piece. We have a lot of this stuff. Although I was like starting to sweat, Brian, as you're going through the list. I'm trying to make sure, do we have that? Do we have that? And I'm pretty sure we do, although I think when I go into the office tomorrow, I'm just going to double check. But we've practiced, and the last practice we did, it was great. Like, we have a core team, and our head of school threw a curveball and took out one of the core members of that team that we rely on a lot and said, the person stayed there, but they said this, you can't use her. Like, she's gone. Like, she was off campus. Just to throw that curveball in. And it did give us pause for a couple minutes. but again, yeah. I'd rather do it when everybody's calm, and then we can go through it, and then we did a debrief. And I'd much rather do it when we're calm than when something happens. So yeah, that's great advice.
Yeah, exactly. And one other thing, if I could just quickly add this in, if there has to be contingency plans in place. So if somebody leaves the school at the end of the school year or during the school year, that there is somebody that replaces that person. Okay. Don't just assume that if you're not keeping your crisis plan up to date, that person is integral. These are 10 to 15 very, very integral people to your core team. So they have to be trained and brought into the fold immediately.
Yeah, that's good advice too, because there is enough turnover at schools that you have to be mindful of that. But so you went through a long list of things. My question is, and it seemed like some of the things are kind of required of the plan. So does a school need a tailored plan, or can they use like a boilerplate? Are they the same? I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
There are aspects of a plan that will be the same with all of them, but for the same reason that every school is different in its own way, taking the temperature, if you will, of a school and understanding how it shows those differences and, what if the school is a K through 5 versus a 5 through 8 or just a high school. There are different aspects of how people will handle the characteristics of what go into this crisis plan. So it really should be tailored very much specifically for each individual school.
And what I'm hearing you say is that even within some of those common or core elements, those have to be tailored as well. I'm thinking about, I didn't even think about that, if you're a K-8 versus a 9-12 or a K-5 and dealing with parents. And then if you're K-5, you're not worried about the high school kids talking to the press.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a good point. That's interesting.
Yeah, exactly. And, different cities have different press corps that act a little bit differently. In some of the smaller towns, the press is going to be a little bit more respectful. I have had in New York City some, as you could probably imagine, some real interesting scenarios with some of the tabloid media.
Wow.
And so, being really prepared for how to work with them and how to intercept them and how to communicate with your parents before they say anything to the media is really essential. It can't be stressed enough how important that is, because I always go under the belief that parents have good intentions. There might be some ego involved, and there might be the glamour of being in the New York Times, but at the same time, not knowing how to work with the media is really an important aspect, and they're not your friends. You got to keep them close. And so I think that's an important aspect of really working with your parents to understand the importance of the media relations.
Yeah, and I think your point is well taken, and we've learned that, is that they're not your friends. They have a job to do, and they're going to do it. And that's hard. I'm thinking of our own experiences, just dealing with the press, and there's just certain things you have to do and not do. But that's a whole nother podcast, Brian.
That's right. We'll do one on media relations.
Oh my gosh! So, what are the most overlooked areas of preparation, like from your experiences in dealing with schools?
Well, I take it from a top-down mentality. Clearly, the head of school is he's your general. He or she is the number one person in charge, and that's understood. But at the same time, the head of school is looking for somebody who can be the lieutenant that will really handle a lot of the day-to-day activities. They expect the plans to be up to date. So having, in a sense, a chief crisis officer is a really important characteristic. And I generally say that it should be the director of communications if there is one at the school. If not, it could be the director of development or advancement. But it's somebody who wears a lot of different hats and is very organized and can also gather people together. That's an important one, because quite honestly, the head of school is too busy to be the chief crisis officer. That's not to say that the head of school isn't the absolute top dog, but at the same time, I really do think that it should be somebody in communications that knows how to do this. Developing a list of key concerns is a really important one. Just start writing down. Write down everything that could go wrong and that has gone wrong or will go wrong, and then build off of that. That's a really important aspect. Developing key messaging, and as I mentioned earlier, holding statements and letters, questions and answers, because having the right things to say to the parents or to the media or to your vendors, for that matter, when you're in the middle of a crisis is a very challenging thing. And even people that are tremendous pros at crisis communications and have dealt with a number of crises, they express concern. They show that it is never what you expect it to be. And really being as prepared as possible is important. So having those letters and Q&As and talking points that I mentioned earlier, those are very important. designing rapid response messages, with consistent, coherent, and compelling messages. That's an important aspect of this because you have to be consistent. You have to really be empathetic and show that you understand where people are coming from in these kind of scenarios. Constantly refining, keeping the plan up to date, because good plans are never finished and they can always be updated more. And making sure that, as a team, you are practicing at least twice a year. I generally say it should be 3 to 4 times a year, but, we know that things can get backburned. So if it's twice a year, that's great, but it really shouldn't be less than that.
Okay, those are all really, really good tips. I have to go back just because, I love social media. And we talked about it earlier. Is there any other aspect of social media as it relates to crisis communication plan that we didn't talk about?
Yeah, I would definitely say the part about monitoring is really important because so much can be resolved, can be determined in advance if you are monitoring conversations on social media. And there are a number of different apps and programs that are really quite good for this. I'll name a few just off the top of my head.
Yep.
Reddit has one called the Keyword Monitor Pro. It's very, very good. With Instagram being as big as it is, there's something called GeoPick. Hootsuite has something called Reputology. And one that's it's certainly more expensive, but it is quite good, is Crisis Response Pro. Now, that's going to run upwards of $3,000 a year, but at the same time, it's very entailed and very detailed of a program. So I think those are some of the good ones. And then the last thing I would say along the lines of social media is running crisis simulations, scenarios and assessing potential scenarios of what could happen and having some of those statements and those little tweets ready or different Facebook posts ready and, having it just ready to go, having about 100 that would come towards us.
Yeah, that's good advice that I'm going to need to take because we have some of the social media stuff ready, but having a little more varied would be good for us. So that's good advice. I have to take that. The other thing that we did when we had an incident is that we just went into Facebook and turned off commenting so that people couldn't, commenting and tagging, at least for the short term, so people couldn't comment on the page or tag the page because we were afraid that might, we're just trying to control things a little bit, that's all.
Yeah, it depends on what the scenario is.
Yeah, exactly.
But I think that sometimes can be a very good strategy.
So this has always kind of intrigued me. What happens when it's all over? Do you have advice for kind of wrap-up follow-up?
Yeah, the most important thing, I think, with this is understanding where people are, what they've experienced, and being really genuine and empathetic. Many people, the way we process things as adults is not going to be the same as how a 6-year-old or a 12-year-old process things. And schools learn things that students will act very different, you might even use the word bizarre. There could be a real regressive component to things, whether it's bedwetting or, not coming to school and just can't deal with things. Everything that a child and a parent and whoever is involved is going through is very, very understandable. So be as empathetic as possible. Don't try to rush a resolution and hear people, listen to them, have times with age-appropriate groups to have them express how they're feeling. And then, other things that I would mention along those lines are that the structure, organization, and leadership make up the difference between, how a crisis is contained and one that sort of spins out of control. So really trying to work with your community and bring in different psychologists and different people that can help the community in some of these ways to get the school back in the right place.
Brian, that's great. I think we'll wrap it up right there. We went from start to finish, and I can't thank you enough. Like I said, there was stuff that I learned and stuff that I have to go check tomorrow. So for me, that's good. I'm always learning. But again, can't thank you enough. Where can people find out more about you and what you're doing?
Well, my website is, as I said earlier, BrainKap. It's BrainKap.com, BrainKap Communications. And social media, I do have different social platforms. Sometimes I'm a little bit more lapsed than I should be on using them because I'm busy doing the work that I have to do. But nevertheless, there is Facebook, there's Twitter, I have a LinkedIn page, so all those kind of things. But I always encourage people to reach out to me and we can just have a discussion. I'm not always just looking for a client. Sometimes I can just advise people and help them do what they need to do.
Great. And maybe you can do that over a cup of coffee and some pancakes.
I like it.
Well, and just as a reminder to everybody, the links and the stuff, the tools that Brian shared, we'll have the links in the show notes. So if you forget them, that's fine. Just go to the show notes and you'll have those links. So, Brian, I can't thank you enough. Appreciate the conversation, and we'll talk soon.
Excellent, Brandon. Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening. But before you go, can I ask a favor? I would love for you to leave an honest review of this show on iTunes. Reviews are the way that more people can find the show and we can get the word out and we can help more people market their school. I've made it easy for you, so if you go to SchneiderB.com/iTunes, it'll take you right where you need to leave the review. So thanks very much, and until next episode.